Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents For Cause and Comrades, Why Men Fought in the Civil War, by James M. McPherson, narrated by David Colacci. Preface. Harriet Beecher Stowe insisted that she did not write Uncle Tom's Cabin. God did. I cannot make the same claim for this book. It would be close to the truth, however, to say that Civil War soldiers wrote it. They articulated their motives for fighting far above my poor power to add or detract. Their uncensored letters and diaries provide fuller and more candid explanations for their decisions to enlist and fight than we have for soldiers in any other war. Many historians have used such sources to explore the thoughts, emotions, and actions of these men, but none has read their diaries and letters with the same questions about why they fought as I have done. 3 million soldiers fought in the Union and Confederate armies. How does an historian discover and analyze the thoughts and feelings of 3 million people? Modern pollsters claim a margin of error of no more than 4% when questioning a sample of 1,000 people to analyze the opinions of, say, 100 million voters. But they do so by selecting a representative sample that stands as an exact epitome of the whole. I cannot construct such a sample of Civil War soldiers, nor can I submit a questionnaire to them. The best I can do is to select a quasi-representative group of soldiers whose letters or diaries have survived, and read those documents with a discerning eye toward answering the questions posed in this book. By quasi-representative, I mean a sample that comes as close as possible to representativeness. My sample consists of 1,076 soldiers, 647 Union and 429 Confederate. This proportion of 40% Confederates overrepresents the actual 29% of all Civil War soldiers who were Confederates, but this overrepresentation seems desirable in order to broaden the base for generalizations about Southern soldiers. The average age at enlistment of Union soldiers in the sample, 25.8 years, is identical with the average age at enlistment for all Union soldiers, while the sample's median age of 23.9 years at enlistment is almost the same as the median for all Union soldiers, 23.5. The average and median ages of the Confederate sample at the time of enlistment were 26.5 and 24.2, respectively. In the Union sample, 29% of the men were married when they joined the Army, which conforms almost exactly with the estimate of 30% of all Union soldiers in the only study of the marital status of Civil War soldiers that I am aware of. Reflecting the mobilization of a larger proportion of the eligible white male population into the Confederate than into the Union Army, 36% of the Confederate sample were married. Soldiers in both samples hailed from the various states in roughly the same proportions, as did all white soldiers. In the Union sample, Massachusetts, Michigan, and Iowa are somewhat overrepresented, and New York and the border states underrepresented, while in the Confederate sample, South Carolina is overrepresented and Tennessee underrepresented. 3% of the Union sample fought in the Navy, compared with about 5% of actual Union personnel. Of the Union Army sample, 82% served in the infantry, 11% in the cavalry, 6% in the artillery, and 2% in the engineers, which slightly underrepresents the cavalry. Of the Confederate sample, only 0.5% were in the Navy, which may underrepresent even that tiny branch of the Confederate service. Of the Confederate Army sample, 78% were infantry, 15% cavalry, and 7% artillery, which conforms closely to the actual percentages in these branches. With respect to age, marital status, geographical distribution, and branch of service, therefore, the samples are fairly representative. In other respects, however, they are not. By definition, the 10 or 12% of all white soldiers who were illiterate are not represented. black Union soldiers and sailors are radically underrepresented. 1% of the Union sample were blacks, compared with almost 9% of all Union personnel. Note, however, that some 70% of black soldiers were illiterate. In both the Union and Confederate samples, foreign-born soldiers are substantially underrepresented. In the Union sample, only 9% of the men were born abroad, compared with 24% of all Union soldiers. Unskilled and even skilled laborers are underrepresented in both samples. Non-slaveholding farmers are underrepresented in the Confederate sample. Indeed, while about 1/3 of all Confederate soldiers belonged to slaveholding families, slightly more than 2/3 of the sample whose slaveholding status is known did so. Men of professional and white-collar occupations are equally overrepresented in the Union sample. Officers are overrepresented in both samples. While some 10% of Civil War soldiers served as officers for at least half of their time in the Army, 47% of the Confederate sample and 35% of the Union sample did so. Both samples are also skewed toward those who volunteered in 1861-62, and therefore contain disproportionately few draftees, substitutes, or those Union soldiers who enlisted in 1863-64 for large bounties. The biases in the sample toward native-born soldiers from the middle and upper classes who enlisted early in the war are unavoidable. These soldiers were more likely to write letters or keep diaries, and their descendants were more likely to preserve them than were working-class, foreign-born, black, or slaveless soldiers. But in one crucial respect, these biases may turn out to be a blessing in disguise. The purpose of this book is to explain the motives of Civil War soldiers for fighting. I am less interested in the motives of skulkers who did their best to avoid combat. My samples are skewed toward those who did the real fighting. What is the evidence for that assertion? The best way to tell who fought is to look at casualty figures. The fighting regiments were those with the highest casualties. The fighting soldiers were those most likely to get killed. While 5% of all Union soldiers were killed or mortally wounded in combat, a startling 17% of the soldiers in the Union sample were killed or mortally wounded. Some 11 or 12% of all Confederate soldiers suffered this fate, compared with 29% of the Confederate sample. Two possible explanations for this phenomenon suggest themselves. Both may be right. First, the groups overrepresented in the sample probably did a disproportionate amount of the fighting. Second, the families and descendants of men killed in action may have been more likely to preserve their letters for posterity than the families and descendants of those who were not killed. In any event, the letters and diaries of these 1,076 Civil War soldiers speak to us across the generations to tell us why they fought. From such writings I have come to know these men better than I know most of my living acquaintances, for in their personal letters, written in a time of crisis that might end their lives at any moment, they revealed more of their inner selves than we do in our normal everyday lives. These letters and diaries have enabled me to answer many of my questions about what they fought for, how they coped with the fear and stress of combat, and why Civil War armies could sustain a far higher level of casualties than any other armies in American history and keep on fighting. This book challenges some of the conventional wisdom about the motives and mentalité of Civil War soldiers. It offers some interpretations that differ from those of other historians. I do not expect readers to take my word alone for these interpretations. That is why I tell the story of why they fought as much as possible in the words of the men who did the fighting. In doing so, I have proceeded on the iceberg principle. Only 1/7 of an iceberg is visible above the water's surface. Likewise, the evidence for soldiers' motivations and opinions and actions presented in the following pages represents only the iceberg tip of the evidence accumulated in my research. For every statement by a soldier quoted herein, at least 6 more lie below the surface in my note cards. In 1993, I delivered the Walter C. Fleming Lectures at Louisiana State University. These 3 lectures were published the following year in a small book entitled What They Fought For, 1861 through 1865. That book focused on the political and ideological issues that Confederate and Union soldiers perceived to be at stake in the war. For Cause and Comrades incorporates these themes of the cause for which Civil War soldiers profess to fight, but goes well beyond them to analyze the full range of causes why they fought and how they coped with the enormous stresses and emotions of combat. Although I have come to know these soldiers and their families familiarly by name, few of them were famous people, and to scatter hundreds of different names over these pages would overwhelm and confuse the reader. Thus, I have normally identified a quoted soldier by his rank, regiment, state, and branch of service. Unless otherwise indicated, such references are to infantry units. For example, a captain in the 51st New York, a private in the 33rd Virginia, a sergeant in the 8th Illinois Cavalry. Readers interested in the names of these soldiers and in the names or identities of the recipients of their letters will find this information in the endnotes. While most Civil War soldiers could make their meaning quite clear in words on paper, and many wrote vigorous, colorful prose, their spelling, grammar, punctuation, and capitalization did not always conform to the rules. Because their departures from these rules sometimes reveal insights into their personalities, education, or state of mind when writing, I have quoted their words exactly as they wrote them, without the intrusive sic to indicate their mistakes. In a very few cases where it was necessary for clarity, I have silently corrected punctuation, or have added the correct spelling of a word in brackets. In other cases, when such words as don't or can't appear without the appropriate apostrophes, they are not typographical errors. I can assure the reader that I know the difference between THERE and THEIR. Those soldiers sometimes mix them up. And as the runner-up in the Freeborn County Spelling Championship in 8th grade, I can also assure the reader that I know how to spell such words as separate and alter, so when they appear as SEPERATE and ALTER, they are not my mistakes or the printer's, nor are the many other misspelled words in the letters of soldiers whose orthography was often delightfully original and creative. Chapter 1. This War is a Crusade. The origins of this book go back many years. In the spring of 1976, I took several Princeton students to Gettysburg for the first of what became many tours of that memorable battlefield. On this occasion, as on subsequent visits, we finished the day by walking the ground over which Pickett's charge took place at the climax of the battle. As we strolled across the open fields in peaceful twilight, knowing that those 13,000 Confederate soldiers had come under artillery and then rifle fire almost every step of the way, students asked in awe, what made these men do it? What motivated them to advance into that wall of fire? What caused them to go forward despite the high odds against coming out safely? I found that I could not give my students a satisfactory answer, but the question planted the seed of a book. Another experience, later that same bicentennial year of 1976, watered the seed. The day after Thanksgiving, my cousin and I visited the 4 Civil War battlefields near Fredericksburg, Virginia. As we stood at the bloody angle of Spotsylvania on that crisp fall afternoon, with no other living creature in sight except a hawk soaring high overhead, the contrast between this pastoral scene and what happened on the same spot 112 years earlier struck me with a painful intensity. Wave after wave of Union attacks against entrenched Confederates during 18 hours of ferocious fighting in the rain on May 12, 1864, had left thousands of killed and wounded men trampled into the mud and muck. Soldiers on both sides had leaped on the parapets and fired down at the enemy with bayoneted rifles handed up from comrades below, hurling each empty gun like a spear before firing the next one until they were shot down or bayoneted themselves. I never expect to be fully believed when I tell what I saw of the horrors of Spotsylvania, wrote a Union officer, because I should be loath to believe it myself had he not been there. As I recounted this story to my cousin, he asked in wonder, what possessed those men? How could they sacrifice themselves in that way? Again, I was not satisfied with my reply. My determination to find an answer deepened. With that cousin, I share a great-great-grandfather who fought in the Civil War. This man, Jesse Beecher, emigrated from England in 1857 and became a prosperous wheelwright in an upstate New York village. In 1862, at the age of 37 and with 8 children, he enlisted in the 112th New York. What moved him to do so? His obituary and family tradition testify to a sense of duty and gratitude to the country that had given him opportunity. Another clue is provided by the name he bestowed on his first child born in the United States, Henry Ward Beecher, after the famous anti-slavery clergyman. Jesse Beecher fought in South Carolina, Virginia, and North Carolina. After his regiment broke through Confederate defenses in the successful attack at Fort Fisher on January 15, 1865, he died in Wilmington, North Carolina, and is buried there in the National Military Cemetery. What motivated him to give the last full measure of devotion for his adopted country? Unfortunately, none of his letters has survived to help resolve this question, but many letters from other soldiers like him suggest possible answers. My initial grappling with the question of Civil War soldiers' motivation occurred during the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Others also probed this puzzle at the time. A veteran who became a student of the Civil War after his tour in Vietnam was awestruck by the dedication of soldiers in that earlier conflict. In all his Vietnam experience, he had met only one American who had the same belief structure as the Civil War soldiers. In Vietnam, the soldier fought for his own survival, not a cause. The prevailing attitude was, do your time, keep your head down, stay out of trouble, get out alive. How different was the willingness of Civil War soldiers to court death in a conflict whose casualty rate was several times greater than for American soldiers in Vietnam. I find that kind of devotion mystifying. When General John A. Wickham, who commanded the famous 101st Airborne Division in the 1970s and subsequently rose to Army Chief of Staff, visited Antietam battlefield in the 1980s, he gazed at Bloody Lane, where several Union assaults had been repulsed before finally breaking through. You couldn't get American soldiers today to make an attack like that, he marveled. Why not? That is probably the wrong question. The right question is, why did Civil War soldiers do it? It was not because their lives were somehow less precious to them than ours to us, nor was it because they lived in a more violent culture that took fighting and dying for granted more than we do. And it was not because they were professional soldiers or coerced conscripts. Most Union and Confederate soldiers were neither long-term regulars nor draftees, but wartime volunteers from civilian life whose values remained rooted in the homes and communities from which they sprang to arms and to which they longed to return. They did not fight for money. The pay was poor and unreliable. The large enlistment bounties received by some Union soldiers late in the war were exceptional. Most volunteers and their families made economic sacrifices when they enlisted. What prompted them to give up several of the best years of their lives, indeed to give up life itself, in this war that killed almost as many American soldiers as all the rest of the wars this country has fought combined? What enabled them to overcome that most basic of human instincts, self-preservation? This is a vital question in all wars, for without such sacrificial behavior by soldiers, armies could not fight. Two psychiatrists who studied American GIs in World War II put it this way: what is the force that compels a man to risk his life day after day, to endure the constant tension, the fear of death, the steady loss of friends? What can possess a rational man to make him act so irrationally? 80 years earlier, the novelist and Civil War veteran John W. DeForest asked the same question and offered an implicit answer. "Self-preservation is the first law of nature," he wrote in summing up his combat experience. "The man who does not dread to die or to be mutilated is a lunatic. The man who, dreading these things, still faces them for the sake of duty and honor is a hero." Duty and honor were indeed powerful motivating forces. They had to be, for some other traditional reasons that have caused men to fight in organized armies had little relevance in the Civil War. Religious fanaticism and ethnic hatreds played almost no role. Discipline was notoriously lax in the Civil War volunteer regiments. Training was minimal by modern standards. The coercive power of the state was flaccid. Subordination and unquestioning obedience to orders were alien to this most democratic and individualistic of 19th century societies. Yet the Union and Confederate armies mobilized 3 million men. How did they do it? What made these men fight? In the middle of the war, none other than Abraham Lincoln enumerated several motives that might induce a man to enlist: patriotism, political bias, i.e., political or ideological conviction, ambition, personal courage, love of adventure, want of employment. In 1864, a Union soldier, less literate but no less lucid than Lincoln, compiled his list of motives in a letter to his father. "A soldier has but one thing in view, and that is to fight the battles of his country with honor, have a liking for all his brothers in arms, and the blessings of God and the prayers of his friends at home." Nearly half a century later, one of the Civil War's genuine heroes, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who won the Medal of Honor for his defense of Little Round Top and earned immortality in Michael Shara's novel The Killer Angels and Ted Turner's movie Gettysburg, tried to explain the willingness of men to face bullets. Simple manhood, force of discipline, pride, love, or bond of comradeship. Here is Bill, I will go or stay where he does. And the officer is so absorbed by the sense of responsibility for his men, for his cause, or for the fight, that the instinct to seek safety is overcome by the instinct of honor. Lincoln, Chamberlain, DeForest, and the soldier's son of a dirt farmer, each in his own way outlined the themes that will be analyzed in this book. Many soldiers did indeed fight bravely for country, duty, honor, and the right. In retrospect, almost all soldiers on both sides believed that they had done so. But in practice, many had found ways to avoid fighting when bullets began coming too close. During the war, a consensus existed that in many regiments, about half of the men did most of the real fighting. The rest were known, in Civil War slang, as skulkers, sneaks, beats, stragglers, or coffee coolers. They played off, shirked, or played sick when battle loomed. They seemed to melt away when the lead started flying, to reappear the next day with tight smiles and stories about having been separated from the regiment in the confusion. Some deserted for good. Some really were sick much of the time. Others got what combat soldiers called bomb-proof jobs, a safe distance behind the lines, headquarters clerk, quartermaster sergeant, wagon train guard, teamster, hospital attendant, and the like. Even the best regiments contained their quota of sneaks. "Strange how many men we have on the rolls and how few we can get into a fight," wrote a captain in the 1st Connecticut Cavalry. 20 or 30 men in my company were miserable excuses for men who shirk all duty if they can. According to a corporal in the 33rd New York, by the end of the 7 days' battles, in our company of 60 men, 11 were in line. The rest of the brigade was nearly as bad as ours. I tell you these things to let you know what a large number of miserable beings there is in the army. In case of a battle, these stragglers are the very ones to start a panic. After the Battle of Fredericksburg, a disgusted private in the 9th New York, who was later killed in action, wrote his brother that "the sneaks in the army are named Legion. When you read of the number of men engaged on our side, strike out at least 1/3 as never having struck a blow." The Confederate Army had the same problem. A private in the crack 21st Mississippi thought that in such a regiment there should be no sloth or sluggard, no whimperer nor complainer. But regrettably the regiment contained an absolutely fearful number of these creatures. The fighting was done by the truly dedicated soldiers, including himself, of course, who had endured privations and suffering like men without murmur or complaint, and this class is sufficiently strong to carry this war through to a glorious end, but this good conduct cannot efface the shameless acts of the other class. Some soldiers admitted to seeking a bomb-proof position or to skulking. A quartermaster sergeant in the 149th New York told his sister that he could have been promoted to orderly sergeant, a combat post. "But I prefer staying where I am. Besides, you know, those rebel bullets don't exactly suit my fancy." After his regiment distinguished itself at Lookout Mountain on November 24, 1863, he wrote home that, "While the battle was going on, I wished myself in the company, but when the wounded began to come in, I congratulated myself that I was not compelled to be where the bullets flew so thick." The diary entries of a private in the 101st New York candidly described his behavior at the Second Battle of Bull Run. August 29, 1862. Marched about 3 miles and fought all day. They marched us up to Reb Battery and we skedaddled, then I fell out and kept out all day. Laid in the wood all night with 5 or 6 others. August 30th. Laid in the woods all day while the rest were fighting. Helping a wounded comrade to the rear was a favorite device to escape further fighting. A private in the 53rd Virginia narrated his actions during the Battle of Malvern Hill on July 1, 1862. "It is an awful thing to be in a battle where the balls is flying as thick as hail," he wrote to his wife. "I saw Dudley on the battlefield soon after he was wounded, and I started with him out. We got to a place where they did not have such a good chance to hit us, and Dudley stayed there. I went a little further on and come to a ditch, and it was crowded with men under the banks." 2 months later, the same soldier confessed that he was one of the thousands of Confederate stragglers who fell out of the ranks before the Army of Northern Virginia fought at Sharpsburg. "I was not up with them the day of the battle, thank God. I have escaped so far, and I hope and trust I may come out safe in the end." Not to be outdone by the Virginians, a North Carolina private with Lee's army assured his wife in 1864 that "there is as good a chance to keep out of the war here as there is there, for if it gets too hot here, we can cross the branch and keep out of it." Many of the derogatory comments about sneaks and stragglers came.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?